The sun had barely begun to spill its golden light across the jagged mesas, painting the desert in a wash of fire and honey, when she stumbled into the secluded clearing, soaked, shivering, and utterly unprepared for the encounter that fate had cruelly, or perhaps divinely, thrown her into. She had been wandering through the labyrinthine canyons, her heart heavy with uncertainty, her mind tangled in thoughts she could not yet name, when her foot caught on a jagged stone hidden beneath the desert sage. One misstep sent her tumbling headlong, her dress soaked with the chill of the morning dew and the rough embrace of the rocky terrain, until she crashed into the steaming bath that had been arranged like a secret, sacred oasis. The water rose around her hot and fragrant, curling steam in delicate ribbons that smelled faintly of cedar, desert wildflowers, and the rich, earthy mineral tones of the canyon itself. Her skin tingled as she struggled to catch her balance, her hands gripping the edge of the bath, trembling both from the cold shock of the fall and from a growing, unnameable awareness that she was not alone. From the shadows of the surrounding rock walls he emerged, silent and imposing, a man whose presence seemed to command the very air around him. He was tall, broad, and impossibly strong, his body moving with the grace and precision of a predator, yet tempered by a quiet reverence, as though he carried both the weight of the earth and the gentleness of the wind upon his shoulders. His eyes, dark and liquid like riverbeds deep beneath the desert sun, locked onto hers, and in that instant, something raw and undeniable passed between them, a silent recognition of desire, power, and inevitability. She felt herself laid bare beneath the intensity of his gaze, every heartbeat and breath amplified, every sense sharpened until even the faintest rustle of a leaf, the whisper of the wind through the canyon, and the distant cry of a hawk seemed part of the charged tableau surrounding them. Her hair, damp and clinging to her shoulders, glistened like spun silk in the morning light, and every droplet of water running down her arms seemed to magnify her vulnerability, her innocence, and the strange, wild thrill that raced through her veins at the sight of him. He approached slowly, each step deliberate and measured, as if he were balancing the line between dominance and tenderness, with a precision that left her both breathless and trembling with anticipation. She wanted to retreat, to hide, to throw herself into the canyon and escape the force that seemed to draw her irrevocably closer, yet every instinct in her body rebelled against flight. Instead, she remained suspended on the edge of fear and fascination, unable to look away, unable to resist the pull of the man who was as much a force of nature as the desert itself. The air around them was thick with the scent of cedar, water, and something uniquely his own, a musky, earthy aroma that seemed to seep into her very skin, igniting a heat that had little to do with the temperature of the bath. His voice, when it came, was a low, resonant rumble that seemed to echo from the canyon walls themselves. "You should not be here," he said, the words carrying no anger, only a commanding softness that made the hairs on her arms rise and her pulse flutter wildly. There was a deliberate calm in his stance, a controlled strength that spoke of years spent mastering both his body and the wild lands he roamed. Yet there was an underlying tenderness that made her feel simultaneously protected and exposed. As he knelt at the edge of the bath, letting his hand skim the water's surface, sending delicate ripples across the steam, she couldn't help but notice the power coiled in every muscle of his arms, the strength that seemed capable of holding, carrying, or protecting in ways she had never imagined. And yet beneath the raw physicality there was a patience, a gentleness that contradicted the fierce aura he exuded, making her wonder how one man could contain such a paradox, both predator and guardian, fire and calm. Every breath she drew was shallow, trembling, charged with an almost unbearable awareness of her own vulnerability, of her wet dress clinging to her body, of her heart pounding with a mix of fear, longing, and the intoxicating thrill of the unknown. She felt exposed in ways she had never been before, every glance, every subtle movement of the warrior, pulling her further into an orbit of desire she could neither fully understand nor resist. The canyon seemed to pause around them, the natural world holding its breath as if it too understood the gravity of the encounter unfolding within its stone embrace. Her eyes followed the subtle motion of his fingers through the steaming water, tracing the line of his forearm, the curve of his shoulders, and the faint shadows that danced across his bronzed skin in the early sunlight. There was a magnetic tension in the space between them, a quiet electricity that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end, and in the press of that moment, she became acutely aware of every sensation. The warmth of the bath against her chilled skin, the softness of the steam curling around her body, the almost imperceptible vibration of his presence as he crouched near her, and the rhythm of her own heartbeat, wild and erratic, echoing in her ears like a drumbeat of surrender. He leaned slightly closer, careful not to overstep, his gaze never leaving hers, and she could feel the faint brush of his warmth even without touch, as if the air around him carried a heat that belonged solely to him. Her mind spun with a dizzying mixture of caution and craving, knowing she should retreat, knowing she should shield herself, yet utterly incapable of moving, as though the desert itself had conspired to hold her in place, to force her to confront the pull she felt toward him. Every instinct she had, the desire for safety, the impulse to flee, the need to remain unseen, was at war with the deep, visceral awareness that something in her had shifted irrevocably, that this meeting was more than chance, more than accident, more than the tumble into a bath that should have been a private sanctuary. She was acutely aware that her life, in all its ordinary rhythm and routine, had been upended in a single irrevocable moment, and that the man before her, the Navajo warrior, the embodiment of strength, grace, and untamed power, was not merely observing her but claiming her, if only in the quiet, unspoken language of intention, presence, and desire. He did not touch her yet, and that restraint only heightened the intensity, making every stolen glance, every subtle shift of muscle or weight, a promise of what could come. A tension so thick it seemed to vibrate in the air like a living thing. Her breath caught as he finally spoke again, a whisper this time, almost carried away by the rising steam. "Do not fear. You are safe here, for now." Even as the words left his lips, she felt the tremor of something deeper, something unspoken, raw, elemental, and irrevocable, flow through the space between them, and she realized with a shock that her very soul had recognized him, that her body had known before her mind that this encounter was fated, that it had been written in the sands, the wind, and the very stones of the canyon long before she had ever stumbled upon it. In that instant, soaked and trembling, yet burning with a strange, delicious heat that seemed to rise from her very core, she understood with terrifying clarity that she had not merely fallen into a bath by accident, she had fallen into a moment, a man and a destiny that would claim her utterly, consuming her in ways she could neither resist nor imagine, and leaving her forever changed. The canyon, the bath, the steam, the soft murmur of water and wind, the scent of cedar and desert blooms, and the magnetic presence of the warrior had coalesced into a single, overwhelming force, and she realized with both fear and awe that her life would never be the same. She had walked into the canyon as a young woman uncertain of her place in the world, and now she trembled in the embrace of a reality that was at once terrifying, intoxicating, and absolutely irresistible, suspended in a perfect charged equilibrium where fear, desire, and surrender coexisted in a delicate, trembling harmony. And as the morning light bathed them both in a honeyed glow, she knew, without doubt, that the accidental fall into the bath had been no accident at all, but the opening of a chapter in her life that promised fire, longing, and a bond as enduring as the mesas themselves, a bond she could neither deny nor escape, and one that would claim her heart, body, and soul for as long as the desert wind whispered through the canyons, carrying with it the scent of cedar, the promise of passion, and the intoxicating presence of the warrior, who had already claimed her in ways she had not yet begun to understand. She remained frozen in the steaming water, her limbs trembling not merely from the heat of the bath but from the electricity that seemed to pulse between them, as if the very air had thickened into something tangible, something that pressed against her skin and whispered promises she had never dared imagine. The warrior knelt at the edge of the bath, his presence both grounding and overwhelming, a force that seemed to exist beyond time itself, tethered only to the rhythm of the canyon, the desert wind, and the beat of her racing heart. His gaze never wavered, dark, deep, and unrelenting. Yet beneath the commanding intensity, she sensed a careful, measured patience, a control that only heightened the raw magnetism he radiated. Every subtle movement, the slight shift of his shoulders, the gentle flex of his fingers in the water, the tilt of his head as he studied her, felt deliberate, like a silent communication that she was both seen and understood in ways no one else ever had. The steam swirled around them, wrapping them in a private haze that blurred the edges of the canyon and dissolved the world outside this hidden bath, leaving only the water, the desert scent, and the warrior who had become the center of her universe without a word of explanation. Her mind swirled with conflicting emotions, fear of the unknown, shame at her vulnerability, longing she had never admitted even to herself, and a strange, almost reverent awe at the sheer strength and beauty of the man before her. She could feel her pulse in her throat, her breath catching in ragged, uneven bursts, and every nerve ending in her body seemed to come alive in response to his quiet, controlled proximity. He extended a hand not to touch, yet impossibly close, the air between them vibrating as though charged with static, and the simple gesture sent a shiver racing along her spine, igniting a fire that she could neither contain nor fully comprehend. Her thoughts scattered, flitting between reason and desire, between the voice in her mind that urged caution and the heat rising in her chest that demanded surrender. She had never encountered anyone like him, someone so rooted in the earth and the wild, yet simultaneously so attuned to the fragility of another human being, capable of wielding power with a gentleness that was almost unbearable in its intensity. Every glance he gave, every subtle motion, carried with it the unspoken weight of intent, a claim made not in words but in presence, and she understood with a shocking clarity that he had already decided, in some unspoken way, that she belonged in the orbit of his life, even if she had not yet realized it herself. Her fingers trembled as they brushed the water's surface, sending ripples across the bath that mirrored the turbulence inside her, each wave a reflection of her fear, desire, and the dizzying realization that she was teetering on the edge of something irreversible. He finally spoke, his voice low and melodic, carrying a weight that seemed to resonate from the very rocks around them. "Do not be afraid. You are here for a reason, and perhaps so am I." The words, simple yet profound, struck a chord deep within her, a chord that vibrated with the promise of connection, of something primal and inexorable, binding them in ways that transcended reason and circumstance. As he leaned slightly closer, the faint brush of his presence against hers, even without touch, sent a cascade of sensations coursing through her body, heat pooling in her stomach, a tightening of the muscles in her thighs, a fluttering in her chest, and a pulse in her ears that made her feel as though the entire world had been reduced to the two of them and the charged space they occupied. She could not deny the growing ache of need that threaded through her veins, nor could she suppress the instinctive awareness that he recognized it, understood it, and perhaps even fed it, drawing her into his gravity with a force that was irresistible. His eyes roamed over her, not in a manner that objectified, but with a reverent, almost worshipful intensity, as though he were memorizing every curve, every line, every imperfection and perfection alike, storing them in memory as sacred artifacts of a fleeting, intimate moment. She felt exposed, yes, but in that exposure there was also a strange, liberating thrill, the recognition that she was being seen in totality, not judged, not diminished, but fully acknowledged and somehow desired. He finally allowed his hand to hover just above the water, fingertips close enough that she could feel the faint radiance of his heat without contact, and the tremor that ran through her was so sharp, so acute that it left her momentarily breathless. Her mind tried to reason, tried to create boundaries, tried to remind herself that this was only a chance encounter, that she should flee, that her dignity and safety demanded distance, but her body, her heart, and some inexplicable elemental part of her soul rebelled against every warning. It was as if the desert itself had conspired to bring them together, as if the canyon walls, the hot mineral water, the cedar-laden air, and the rising sun had orchestrated a moment in which fear and desire, innocence and knowledge, past and future, all collided in the crucible of the present. And then he spoke again, his words soft, deliberate, carrying a weight of promise and inevitability that made her pulse flutter uncontrollably. "The desert chooses. It has chosen you as it has chosen me. Do you feel it?" She nodded, unable to speak, because to articulate the truth of what she felt would have been to admit more than her mind or heart could yet handle. And in the silence that followed, thick with the unspoken and the undeniable, she realized with a start that the act of her fall into his bath, the accident that should have been embarrassing, terrifying or humiliating, had instead brought her to the edge of an awakening, a recognition that some forces could not be avoided, only surrendered to. The warrior reached slowly, deliberately, and let the tip of his fingers brush against hers as they skimmed the water's surface together, an almost imperceptible touch that sent lightning-like sparks through her nerves, igniting a fire in her chest that mingled with the heat of the bath, the rising sun and the raw, untamed power of his presence. Every instinct, every caution, every social boundary she had known seemed to dissolve in that single, delicate moment, leaving only the primal, intimate truth of their encounter, that they were meant to collide, meant to feel, meant to taste and touch and know one another in ways that were beyond words, beyond rules, beyond reason. She gasped softly, the sound almost drowned by the gentle lapping of the water, yet he heard it, as though attuned to the smallest vibration of her being, and a small, knowing smile touched the corners of his lips. That smile, subtle yet commanding, conveyed both reassurance and desire, a message that was as clear as the desert sky and as deep as the canyon shadows. She belonged here, with him in this moment, in this sacred space where the ordinary rules of the world did not apply. And as she shivered again, not from cold but from anticipation, realization dawned fully upon her. She was no longer merely a young woman caught in an accident. She had become a participant in a dance as old as the land itself, a dance of temptation, surrender, and awakening, orchestrated by the silent, invisible hand of fate, and conducted by the hands, eyes, and presence of the Navajo warrior, who had already begun to claim her in every sense that truly mattered. In that bath, surrounded by steam, sunlight, and the eternal stone walls of the canyon, she understood that she had stepped into a world where her heart, her body, and her soul were no longer entirely her own, where fear mingled with desire, where vulnerability became power, and where the first, tentative sparks of a connection that would consume her entirely had ignited, blazing like wildfire across the untamed landscape of her very being, leaving her trembling, breathless, and achingly alive in a way she had never imagined possible. The moment stretched, suspended in time as the desert seemed to shrink around them, leaving only the bath, the rising steam, and the magnetic presence of the warrior who had captured her senses so completely that she could no longer distinguish where she ended and the intensity of the encounter began. She shivered again, but this time not from cold, the heat of the bath and the heat of him, the proximity, and the invisible pull of his gaze mingled to send a fire coursing through her veins that left her trembling with anticipation. He leaned just slightly closer, careful yet deliberate, his body radiating strength and control, a presence so commanding that every instinct within her rebelled, even as every pulse in her body demanded surrender. Her hands gripped the edge of the bath, knuckles white, yet every nerve ending seemed to hum with awareness, every hair on her arm standing on end as though the desert itself had conspired to heighten her senses to the point of exquisite pain and pleasure. She realized with a dizzying mix of fear and longing that she had never encountered anything like him. Not a man, not a presence, not a touch, and the realization both thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. The air around them was thick with scent, the cedar, the minerals of the steaming water, the faint tang of sweat on his skin, the aroma of her own wet hair and skin mingling with the environment. It was a heady, intoxicating mixture, one that seemed to wrap itself around her, pressing into her lungs, her skin, and her mind until the world outside ceased to exist entirely. He watched her with a deliberate intensity, not rushing, not forcing, but allowing the tension to build. A controlled predator observing prey who was entirely willing, entirely caught, and entirely drawn into his orbit. She could feel the strength coiled beneath his skin, the potential for both protection and passion, and it sent a tremor through her body she could not name or resist. The desert around them, silent except for the faint rustle of sage and the distant cry of a hawk, seemed to mirror the storm building between them, a quiet chaos of heat, longing, and inevitability. Every glance he gave her, every fraction of a movement, carried the weight of intention, and she understood with a shiver that this was no mere curiosity, no fleeting attraction. It was a claim, a silent, unspoken declaration that had been made the instant she stumbled into his world, into his bath, into his presence, and she had no choice but to recognize it. Her mind raced, spinning through caution, propriety, and reason, yet her body ignored every warning, responding instead to the gravity of his nearness, the subtle brush of heat that seemed to radiate from him like a physical force. She felt exposed, completely vulnerable, yet paradoxically empowered by the fact that he saw her fully, understood her fully, and in that recognition, had begun to weave an unspoken bond that was as thrilling as it was terrifying. His fingers, now closer to hers, skimmed the surface of the water in small, deliberate arcs, sending delicate ripples that mirrored the chaos within her, a tangible reflection of the storm building in her chest. She watched the motion, mesmerized, and felt a sudden, urgent awareness of her own heartbeat, rapid and erratic, a wild rhythm that seemed both to belong to her and to echo his own presence like a drumbeat in the canyon, the subtle tension in his posture, the deliberate control in his movements. The way he measured every inch of proximity without crossing boundaries, all of it combined to create a heady cocktail of desire, fear, and longing that made her breath catch in her throat. And then, finally, he spoke, his voice low, smooth, and resonant, a vibration that seemed to travel directly to her chest, bypassing her ears entirely. Do you feel it? The way the desert draws us together? It has not been chance that brought you here. The words, gentle yet commanding, sent a shiver through her spine, an acknowledgement of the invisible force that had governed this encounter from the moment her foot slipped and her body fell into the steaming water. She could only nod, unable to speak, the emotion in her chest too overwhelming to articulate, yet the subtle quiver in her lips, the rapid intake of breath, and the trembling of her fingers conveyed the storm raging within her more eloquently than any words could. He leaned slightly closer, careful not to touch, yet radiating a heat so palpable that it pressed into her skin like a living thing, and she could feel the pull of his presence, a magnetic tug that threatened to strip her of all resistance, all pretense, all self-possession. It was not lust alone that held her in thrall, though the desire coursing through her veins was undeniable. It was also the intimacy, the recognition, the understanding that he could see her fully, read her body and mind with the precision of one attuned to the rhythms of both land and spirit, and respond not with judgment, but with an almost sacred reverence that left her breathless and trembling. She became acutely aware of the smallest sensations, the way her wet hair clung to her collarbone, the heat rising from her own skin, the scent of cedar and minerals mingling with the faint musky aroma emanating from him, and the electric charge of proximity that made every nerve stand on end. Every instinct she had screamed to flee, to hide, to regain control. Yet every instinct she had ever ignored, the ones she had kept buried beneath propriety and caution, reached out toward him, urging her to stay, to surrender, to feel and to acknowledge that some forces were beyond reasoning, beyond morality, and perhaps beyond even her own understanding. The steam rose in thick curling wisps around them, blurring the edges of the world and isolating them in a private cocoon of warmth, scent, and tension. He allowed his hand to hover just above the water, fingertips tantalizingly close to hers, the invisible barrier between them alive with electricity, as though the very universe conspired to heighten every sense, every nerve, every heartbeat to a pitch that bordered on agony and ecstasy simultaneously. She felt the tremor that passed through her body as if the desert itself had infused her veins with fire, her pulse racing, her chest tight, and a strange, dizzying lightness overtaking her senses. And yet, even in the heat of the moment, there was a strange serenity in his presence, a quiet command that made her feel simultaneously unprotected and utterly safe, as though surrendering to him would not destroy her but instead awaken some deeper, more primal truth she had long denied. His eyes, dark and unyielding, softened only in the faintest flicker when they met hers, conveying 1,000 unspoken assurances, 1,000 promises of patience, respect, and desire, and she felt herself melting under the weight of that gaze, as though every layer she had ever used to shield herself had been stripped away, leaving her raw, exposed, and achingly alive. She realized with a start that the fall into the bath, the accident she had once thought embarrassing and humiliating, had become the first step in a journey she could neither escape nor resist, a journey where the desert, the canyon, the water, and this formidable yet tender man had conspired to reveal desires, fears and longings she had never dared acknowledge. And as she inhaled, chest rising and falling rapidly, she felt the gravity of the moment, the inexorable pull of his presence, and the undeniable truth that she had already crossed a threshold. The moment where fear and desire, hesitation and surrender, innocence and awakening, all coalesced into a singular, overwhelming truth that would shape the rest of her life. The bath, the rising steam, the canyon, and the warrior were no longer mere surroundings. They were a crucible, a sacred space where the ordinary rules of the world did not apply, where every glance, every breath, every flicker of movement carried with it the weight of intention, connection, and unspoken promise. And as the morning light streamed across the water, catching the droplets on her skin, glinting like liquid fire, she understood, with the profound clarity of someone standing at the edge of irrevocable surrender, that she had not merely fallen into a bath by accident. She had fallen into a man's orbit, into a force of nature both terrifying and divine, into a moment charged with desire, intimacy, and a magnetic, elemental bond that would claim her heart, body, and soul in ways she could neither resist nor fully comprehend. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she met his gaze, the tension between them taut and electric. A rope stretched across the chasm of the canyon itself, and she knew with both fear and longing that this encounter, the accident, the bath, the warrior, was only the beginning, the first flicker of a fire that would burn hot, wild, and inescapable. A fire she would willingly step into, surrendering to the strength, the passion, and the unspoken claim of the man who had already ensnared her entirely, in body, mind, and soul. The heat of the bath had become more than a comfort. It was a conduit, carrying warmth from the water into her limbs, her chest, her very core, mingling with the heat emanating from the warrior's body as he knelt beside her, close enough that every subtle movement, every measured shift of weight, sent tremors through her nerves she had never known existed. She could feel the magnetic pull of him in a way that was almost physical, a gravity stronger than reason, stronger than propriety, stronger even than fear, drawing her toward him in a slow, deliberate inevitability that made her breath hitch and her pulse accelerate beyond control. The canyon walls, silent and immovable, seemed to lean in with them, enclosing their secret world in a quiet intimacy, isolating them from the outside, and amplifying every flicker of expression, every hint of motion, every unspoken thought that passed between them. His eyes, dark as midnight under the desert sun, remained fixed on hers, reading every flinch, every shiver, every rapid intake of breath, and in their depth she felt a recognition, a claim, an undeniable acknowledgement of the vulnerability she had so violently exposed by her fall. She had never imagined that someone could look at her, not just at the curves of her body, not merely at the wet silk of her dress clinging to her frame, but truly see her, every nuance, every flicker of thought and feeling, and respond with both a commanding presence and a careful, almost sacred restraint. The effect was intoxicating, nearly overwhelming, a cocktail of fear, anticipation, longing, and a burgeoning, uncontainable desire that made her skin tingle and her heart hammer. Her fingers trailed along the edge of the bath, barely touching the water, but the ripple created by the slightest motion seemed to mirror the storm building inside her, a turbulence of emotion and instinct she could neither name nor deny. He reached a hand slowly, deliberately above the water, letting his fingertips hover just shy of her own, teasing the boundary between them without breaking it. And the electricity that sparked in that silent gap made her gasp involuntarily. Every instinct in her screamed to flee, to pull back, to regain control. Yet another, deeper instinct, one she had never fully acknowledged, urged her forward, closer, to surrender herself, even if only a fraction, to the force that had become him. The faint brush of the steam around them, carrying the scent of cedar, minerals, and something uniquely him wrapped around her senses, heightening every sensation, making the air itself seem charged with a quiet, dangerous intimacy. She shivered again, and this time, the tremor was not from the water but from the profound awareness of his presence, the magnetic pull of his body and soul, and the undeniable truth that the moment she had fallen into this bath had irrevocably altered the course of her life. He lowered his hand slightly, letting the tip of his finger just brush hers, and the contact was electric, intimate, and reverent all at once. The small, deliberate touch sent a current through her, igniting a heat that mingled with the warmth of the water, a sensation that left her both trembling and craving more. She realized with a shiver that seemed to rattle her very bones that she was being drawn into something far greater than herself, something elemental and irresistible, a connection that transcended the ordinary, a force as primal as the desert wind and as timeless as the canyon walls that enclosed them. His voice, when he finally spoke again, was a soft murmur, low and melodic, vibrating in her chest rather than her ears. "You are here now. You are mine, if you will allow it." The words, spoken with such deliberate control, carried a weight she could feel in every part of her body, a claim that was neither violent nor aggressive, but unyielding in its inevitability. She could only nod, unable to form words, her lips trembling with a mixture of fear, anticipation, and a growing, undeniable desire that left her breathless. Her hands, still gripping the edge of the bath, shook not with fear but with the electric awareness of her own body, responding instinctively to the pull of his presence, to the promise in his gaze, to the unspoken invitation in every line of his posture. He leaned slightly closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, the subtle brush of his breath against her cheek, the faint scent of cedar and earth mingling with the natural heat of his body, and the steam that rose between them. Every nerve in her body ignited at the proximity, at the tension, at the promise of what might come, and she felt herself surrendering just a fraction to the inevitability of it. The water lapped gently around them, the sound amplified in the stillness of the canyon, punctuating the silence with a rhythm that matched the frantic beating of her heart. She dared to glance down at his hands, watching the deliberate strength in his fingers as they hovered, waiting, and she felt a shiver of recognition pass through her. That touch, when it came, would not merely be skin on skin, but an affirmation, a claim, a sacred acknowledgement of her surrender and his intent. And yet, even as her body responded to the tension and the pull, there was a strange serenity, a trust blooming within her chest, that told her she was not merely yielding to desire, but stepping into a connection that had been destined long before this moment. The canyon, the bath, the rising steam, the scent of cedar and desert flowers, and the magnetic presence of the warrior all fused into a single overwhelming awareness. And she felt every heartbeat, every breath, every tremor amplified beyond comprehension. Her mind tried to reason, tried to conjure arguments for retreat, for propriety, for caution, but every thought was drowned out by the torrent of sensation, by the pull of his gaze, by the warmth of his proximity, by the unspoken yet undeniable declaration that this moment, this bath, this fall, this encounter, was entirely, irrevocably theirs. He finally let his fingers brush against hers again, just a fleeting touch, yet the effect was catastrophic, a spark that ignited a conflagration in her body and soul, leaving her trembling with desire, anticipation, and the dizzying awareness of the power he wielded without cruelty or malice. Her eyes locked on his, searching for some signal, some indication of intention, yet all she found was patience, control, and a magnetic pull that left her powerless and willing in equal measure. And in that moment she understood the truth of the desert, of the canyon, of the bath, and of the man who had claimed her attention, that some forces were inevitable, some desires uncontainable, and some connections, once initiated, could never be undone. The sun climbed higher, scattering golden light across the water, the canyon walls and her damp hair clinging to her skin, turning every droplet into molten fire, and she felt herself melting not from heat, but from the intensity of presence, from the undeniable pull of the warrior who had already begun to inhabit every corner of her thoughts and every tremor of her body. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, each breath shallow and trembling, each heartbeat a drumbeat echoing the storm inside her, and she knew with the clarity of instinct that she had passed a threshold she could never return from, the threshold where desire, surrender, and inevitability converged, leaving only the raw, unfiltered awareness of connection and the thrilling, terrifying, exquisite certainty that she was entirely, irrevocably his. And as the water steamed, as the desert wind whispered through the canyon, as the warrior's presence loomed and held her, she allowed herself to lean forward just slightly, a tentative acknowledgement of the inevitability of their connection, a small step toward the fire that had already begun to consume her from within, leaving her trembling, breathless, and achingly alive in a way that would forever mark the moment she fell into his world, and into him completely, utterly, and forever. The moment that had been building, simmering beneath every glance, every touch, every shiver of anticipation, finally broke the invisible dam between them, and the world around the bath, the canyon, the rising steam. The scent of cedar and desert sage seemed to melt away, leaving only the two of them, suspended in a timeless, charged space where nothing existed but presence, desire, and the undeniable pull of destiny. She felt his gaze, unwavering and deep, sweep over her once more, and it was as if he were memorizing not just her body, glistening with water droplets that caught the golden sunlight, but the very essence of her being, every tremor of breath, every subtle hesitation, every beat of her heart. The air around them seemed electric, thick with unspoken promise, and she realized with a shock of clarity that surrendering to him in this moment was not an act of weakness but of recognition, an acknowledgement that some forces, like the desert wind, the relentless sun, and the inevitable pull of fate, were irresistible and absolute. He finally moved slowly, deliberately, bridging the final inches between them with the precision of a predator who understood both the art of patience and the power of touch. His fingers traced the curve of her shoulder, lingering just enough to ignite a fire that raced down her spine and pooled in her chest. Leaving her gasping, trembling, utterly consumed by the intensity of sensation, she leaned slightly toward him, a reflexive, instinctive response to the invisible force drawing her closer. And in that movement, the space between anticipation and fulfillment collapsed. The water sloshed gently around them, steam curling in ethereal wisps, mingling with the scent of cedar, wildflowers, and the warm, musky heat of his skin, creating a cocoon of intimacy that left them both suspended in a world apart from time, logic, and the outside gaze of civilization. His lips brushed hers, light, tentative, exploratory at first, and the impact was electric, a spark that ignited every nerve in her body, leaving her chest heaving and her thoughts scattered in the delirium of sensation. She returned the kiss instinctively, hands pressing against his chest, feeling the controlled power in his muscles, the steady heartbeat that somehow mirrored her own rapid rhythm, the warmth and solidity of a presence she could both fear and crave simultaneously. The bathwater lapped around them, the sound magnified by the canyon walls, a delicate percussion that underscored the intensity of every touch, every sigh, every tremor of anticipation. He held her close, his hands firm yet gentle, exploring the contours of her body with a reverence that left her breathless and achingly alive. And in the process, she understood the depth of the claim he had made from the moment she stumbled into his bath. The claim that had never been violent, never been demanding, but had always been patient, controlled, and inescapably powerful. Every inch of skin that brushed against his, every slight shiver that passed through her, as his fingers trailed along her arms and shoulders, spoke of a connection beyond the physical, a union of presence, desire, and the quiet understanding that they were meant to collide in this way, at this time, in this hidden oasis amidst the desert wilderness. She felt her body responding to him in ways she had never anticipated, a heat that radiated from her core, a thrill that surged through every nerve ending, a trembling desire that left her senses suspended between the terror of exposure and the ecstasy of intimate surrender. And yet within that trembling she also felt a serenity, a strange calm that reassured her that this union, this moment, was not a danger but a revelation, a truth she had been unconsciously seeking, a force she had longed for without knowing its shape or form. His lips moved along her collarbone, down the gentle slope of her neck, eliciting soft, involuntary sighs that mingled with the sound of water, the whisper of the wind, and the distant cry of hawks circling above the canyon walls. Every touch was measured, deliberate, respectful, and yet carried the full weight of his desire, a combination of strength, patience, and intensity that left her utterly enthralled, trembling with the awareness of the connection they were forging. Her hands roamed cautiously, reverently, exploring the lines of his shoulders, the strength of his arms, the warmth of his chest, each movement a mirror of the intimacy he offered without rush, without force, allowing them to create a rhythm together, a silent choreography of desire, surrender, and awakening. The bath, the canyon, and the rising sun around them seemed to hold their breath, preserving the moment in golden light and steam, until nothing existed but heat, touch, scent, and the symphony of their hearts beating in tandem. She felt herself surrender completely, not just to him, but to the inevitability of the connection that had been written long before this morning, in the rhythm of the desert, the flow of the water, the wind that had whispered through the canyon, and the ancient unspoken pulse of the land itself. Their movements became more confident, more entwined, a perfect balance of passion and tenderness, each touch, each brush of skin, each whispered sound drawing them deeper into a state of union that was both physical and spiritual, a communion of hearts, bodies, and souls. She gasped as his lips brushed hers again, firmer this time, claiming and honoring all the vulnerability she had laid bare, and she responded with equal intensity, a fire kindling within her that matched the heat of the bath, the blaze of the rising sun, and the wild, untamed energy that radiated from him like the desert itself made flesh. Every motion, every sigh, every shiver was a testament to the depth of their connection, the inevitability of their union, and the intoxicating realization that they had found in one another something beyond desire, a resonance, a recognition, a claim that neither time nor circumstance could undo. And as the bathwater lapped gently around them, the steam curling like smoke around their intertwined bodies, the desert sun casting golden ribbons across her wet hair and his bronzed skin, she knew with a clarity that left her breathless that she had crossed a threshold she could never return from. She was no longer simply a woman caught in an accident. She was a participant in a force that had claimed her entirely, a force embodied in the fierce, tender, and magnetic presence of the Navajo warrior who had become the center of her universe with a single, deliberate look. And as they clung to each other, lips brushing, hands exploring, hearts beating in tandem with the rhythm of the canyon, she surrendered utterly, not in fear, not in shame, but in recognition, in acceptance, in the exquisite, overwhelming awareness that this man, this moment, this union of body, mind and spirit was her destiny. The bath, the canyon, the steam, and the desert itself had orchestrated a meeting that was at once accidental and fated. And now, as she felt the full intensity of his claim, the gentle yet irresistible force of his desire and recognition, she knew with a rush of ecstasy and trembling surrender that she belonged entirely to this moment, to this man, and to the fire that had ignited within her from the instant she had stumbled into his hidden oasis. Every shiver, every sigh, every brush of skin against skin, every whispered sound was a confirmation of a bond as enduring as the canyon walls themselves, as timeless as the desert wind. And she realized with a heady, intoxicating rush that this union, born of chance, desire and fate, would remain with her forever, etched into her body, her soul, and the very core of her being. And in the glow of the rising sun, amidst the steam, the water, and the scent of cedar and desert sage, she surrendered completely, utterly, and irreversibly, feeling for the first time in her life the full, intoxicating power of being seen, desired, and claimed by a man who understood her in ways she had never known were possible. And in that surrender, she found not just pleasure, not just desire, but a profound, elemental, and breathtaking awakening that would leave her forever changed.